Tonight, the president poised to address a divided nation as he goes to battle on trade and stuns the world, freezing aid to Ukraine.
Global stocks plunge over new Trump tariffs.
In an unprecedented move, US President Donald Trump has suspended all military aid to Ukraine, effective immediately.
Yes, President Trump again dominates the agenda, taking drastic action which will have an impact around the world. So, how do global leaders and diplomats navigate this seemingly ever-changing landscape? And can the United Kingdom stay on his good side? If we ever needed proof that a week really is a long time in politics, how's this? On the Thursday, the British Prime Minister is in Washington to meet President Trump. Friday, it was Ukrainian President Zelensky's turn at the White House, where a photo op descended into unprecedented chaos and a row in front of the cameras. Saturday, Zelensky stops in London on his way back to Kyiv for a meeting with Prime Minister Starmer and other European leaders. Tuesday, Trump withdraws all US military support for Ukraine, plus his tariffs against China and Canada come into effect. Our TRT World correspondent Joel Flynn is in Kyiv. Joel, welcome to Westminster Watch. How has this all played out in Ukraine?
Well, Ukrainians obviously watched what transpired in the Oval Office with a degree of horror. Horror at the explosive nature of the meeting itself, horror at the way that they were treated, and horror, of course, over the implications of the fallout between Donald Trump and President Volodymyr Zelensky. The implications of the meeting have been fairly quick to come to terms with, and difficult for a country that has been at war for, as far as the Ukrainians are concerned, not just the last 3 years, but the last 11 years, since 2014 and since the Russian occupation of Crimea. They felt that Volodymyr Zelensky was advocating a position that most Ukrainians feel is representative of them, even if he didn't necessarily do so in a way that was effective in a diplomatic sense. He talked about the fact that they don't trust Putin. This is a country that has signed multiple agreements and ceasefires with the Russians, and Zelensky in that meeting talked about the fact that the Russians have, on 25 occasions, breached those agreements. But the military funding being paused has really been a bit of a game changer. There is a stockpile of weapons that Ukrainian politicians reckon could last them about 6 months or so, but the equipment that the Americans provide is obviously very, very important to them and could really restrict them in a longer term sense. What has really shifted here is the change in tone that we've seen from Volodymyr Zelensky, and particularly the way that that seems to have been received by Donald Trump. We haven't heard an apology yet, but whatever it is that Zelensky has said behind the scenes to the US president seems to have done something.
Earlier today, I received an important letter from President Zelensky of Ukraine. The letter reads, "Ukraine is ready to come to the negotiating table as soon as possible to bring lasting peace closer. Nobody wants peace more than the Ukrainians," he said.
So what position does this put both the UK and other European countries in?
Well, I think the European countries really can't honestly say that they were caught off guard by this, even if this has happened really rather fast. The essence of what Donald Trump's administration was going to do had been flagged fairly well in advance. European countries for some time have known that they have not been spending what is required of them, certainly as far as NATO defense budgets are concerned, and they know that they were heavily reliant on the United States, so they can't sit there and say, this is not something that we necessarily saw coming. Nonetheless, this is a problem for them. Problematic in the sense that they have to make up this shortfall in aid for Ukraine that the United States military is no longer contributing. Problematic too in the sense that they don't have their own military capacity to make up for the United States withdrawing and providing the sorts of things and sorts of defensive capacities that have been provided for decades in Europe. The other issue for Europe as far as Ukraine is concerned is that most European leaders believe that this is a war, the war in Ukraine is a war that is being fought here so that it doesn't have to be fought closer to Europe's borders. They have said publicly that once Ukraine falls, they don't know who is going to be next, who is going to be targeted by Russia next. They don't trust Vladimir Putin. They've been clear about this. They talk about that in public in the same way that Zelensky has talked about as well. So how they deal with this situation is something that they are having to figure out in real time. Ultimately, Donald Trump has changed things, though, and he's changed things in the diplomatic circles and in the political circles, and he's changing things on the front line as well. This is a different world that we are dealing with. The Ukrainians know this, and the Europeans know this as well.
Joel Fryn, our correspondent in Kyiv, thanks very much for joining us here on Westminster Watch. And I'm joined now by Ukrainian staff writer for The Spectator, Svitlana Morentes, former British diplomat Ian Proud, and Liberal Democrat MP for West Dorset and member of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, Edward Morello. Welcome to you all. Svitlana, may I start with you? You came to this country at the beginning of the war in Ukraine as a refugee. Tell me, these last few days, when we've seen what's been happening diplomatically with Ukraine, how do you feel?
Outraged and disappointed, of course, because Ukraine has already suffered so much and Ukrainians have fought so bravely for 3 years. And here our president comes to the US asking for help, and he's treated so badly. And I would say that Zelensky was the one being disrespected. The questions about what he is wearing when his country is fighting for its survival, it was horrible. And you would expect that the US would side with Ukraine on this issue, because Ukraine was the one that was invaded. Russia attacked us, and for now it seems that the Trump's administration is just siding with Russia.
Let's just play ourselves a clip of the meeting with President Zelensky to remind ourselves what we're actually talking about here.
Your country's in big trouble.
Can I
Wait a
answer?
minute. No. You've done a lot of talking. Your country is in big trouble.
I know.
To dictate that.
That's
Remember
exactly
this.
what
I'm not
You're in
dictating.
no position to dictate what we're going to feel.
You
We're
will-
going to feel very
you will
good.
feel influenced.
We're going to feel very
I'm
good and
telling
very
you,
strong.
You will feel influence.
You're right now not in a very good position.
Ian, cast your mind to when you were a diplomat. If you were walking down the corridor on your way to the Oval Office to have a meeting with President Trump, what would be going through your mind? What would your strategy be?
Well, firstly, be thinking about what I wanted to get out of the meeting, and I understand the purpose of that meeting was to sign some sort of minerals deal. A lot of debate about that. It got sidetracked, obviously, by discussion about Zelensky's attire, and then he went into a monologue about, the issues we understand about how Ukraine has been invaded by Russia, and it led us down a rabbit hole, which actually served nobody's purposes very well and actually reflected Trump, Vance, and I think also Zelensky in a bad light.
So tell me, in a broader issue, even putting to one side the Zelensky meeting, can any diplomat successfully strategize with a president so unpredictable as President Trump?
Well, I don't think there's really been any strategy since the start of the war in Ukraine, or indeed right back to the start of the Ukraine crisis in 2014. There's been an absence of strategy, and Trump has come in and filled that vacuum, and we are now left having to pivot at pace to kind of follow on with very little control about Trump's actions going forward.
I think you've got to be careful when it comes to Trump, to try and apply diplomatic norms. I think time and time again we react to him as if this behaviour is unusual, when in fact we have done this for 4 years already. We've had a 4-year Trump presidency. This is Trump 2.0, and it seems to be Trump on steroids. But you can't just sort of pretend that this is business as usual, or that you can expect everyone to abide by common international decency when he has a very different approach.
An extraordinary meeting, Ian, but is that going to make every other leader around the world very wary of doing business with Trump?
I think leaders around the world were worried about doing business with Trump before the election. He is a reality. We've got to get on and deal with it and bring an end to this needless war that has killed and injured over 1 million people already. And I love Ukraine. It's a country that I've been to many times while I was kind of posted to Russia. It's a wonderful country, wonderful people. I'm actively in favour of Ukraine joining the European Union. I've said that very many times. This stalemate we're in right now isn't helping us to get there. We need to bring peace.
Well, actually, let's take up on that point. Since that meeting, of course, things have moved at a dramatic pace, Svitlana, to the point now where Zelensky and President Trump may very well sign the deal on minerals that many say will provide the security that Ukraine needs from, if you like, further incursions by an aggressive Putin. I mean, his tactics may be clumsy, they may be offensive, but President Trump might have got his way.
Not a single Ukrainian believes that the deal will bring any security guarantee for Ukraine. There were American businesses on the east of Ukraine when Russia invaded, and they fled as soon as the war started. Right now, there are American businesses in Ukraine, and they're being bombed. So I don't see how American workers or businessmen staying in Ukraine would deter the next Russian aggression. Will they be fighting Russian soldiers, or they will just flee? And that is the main problem for Ukraine. And that is also why the argument started in the Oval Office, because Zelensky was like, I'm ready to sign the minerals deal, but I want to have security guarantee. And that's what Trump is not ready to provide.
Yeah, at the moment we have no details on what the security guarantee actually looks like. This is a very transactional president. And you've got to be careful about, if you don't have it written down in blood, exactly how valid is any deal. We saw the administration come in and start immediately renegotiating the mineral deal to make it far more punitive on Ukraine and forcing them to sign away their rights for future generations, which is quite an outrageous ask of an ally.
Although the UK has also signed a 100-year deal with Ukraine, which also has clauses in it on access to mineral rights in Ukraine, so we can't actually completely criticise what the Americans are doing when the British government is looking to do exactly the same thing.
But did they leave Ukraine with 500 billion of debt to the UK that Trump was
I'm not
asking?
saying I support the mineral deal. I'm just saying that the British government is pursuing exactly the same thing that the Trump government is doing, and actually Starmer is now selling out Ukraine because he recognises that he needs a trade deal and trade talks with the US more than he needs to support the war in Ukraine. The state visit, the historic second state visit of Trump to the UK will be a chance to kind of solidify the UK's rebranded image as the kind of best friend of the state.
I mean, that's quite a substantive charge that you're making, that the British Prime Minister is putting his own interests totally in, if you like, in the hand of Donald Trump, and Ukraine peace settlement, shall we say, an unsatisfactory Ukraine peace settlement would be the price worth paying for a trade deal? Are you really saying that?
Well, I'm not saying an unsatisfactory peace settlement. I'm saying a peace settlement because people are dying every day. And Keir Starmer's narrative has changed radically since he met Donald Trump in the White House on the 27th of February before the Zelensky car crash meeting. So believe me, since Mandelson has arrived in Washington, there's been a fundamental rethink of what the UK wants out of its relationship with the US under Trump and actually what it wants for the war in Ukraine.
Your leader, Ed Davey, in the House of Commons at the last Prime Minister's question time, once again suggested that President Trump is an unreliable ally. Do you see that Britain's current Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, is effectively putting his faith in an unreliable ally?
I think you have to manage Trump and manage the risks associated with it and understand how transactional he is. When we talk about, it's not just Ukraine. We see, the withdrawing of US aid globally. We see threats to Jordan of withdrawing support unless they take Gazans. This is a guy who is, using fiscal or financial benefit or for the US in order to bully his allies. So I think you have to be really careful when you take, as Starmer has done, him at his word when he says, don't worry, I've got your backs, Article 5 is safe. I don't know that there are many other countries in NATO that are making foreign policy and defence decisions based on a firm belief that America will fulfil its Article 5 obligations. We're one of the few countries left that does that.
The UK has also cut its overseas aid commitments down to 0.3% of GDP, and David Lammy, in a pre-election speech to the Institute for Government,
David Lammy being the Foreign Secretary,
the current Foreign Secretary, said he couldn't believe how embarrassed British ambassadors must be to have to tell hosts about the cut of aid under the previous Conservative government from 0.7%.
But that's just realpolitik kicking in. They're dealing with the real world, aren't they?
But actually, you've talked about sort of US aid withdrawal. Britain is doing exactly the same. Britain is also copying the US position on the minerals deal.
We are reducing aid, and the Liberal Democrats absolutely have a problem with the reduction in ODA, but we are not making it transactional. We're not saying unless you do this, we'll give you this. That is leveraging international development for financial benefit. That's completely different.
Svitlana.
I wanted to add that I think Keir Starmer is doing a very good job mediating between Trump and Zelensky, because unfortunately...
You think he is doing a good job?
I think he is doing a good job. He's trying, at least. Because unfortunately, US is the only country who can help settle the war in Ukraine, and Trump is the only leader who could do it. The problem right now is that he is siding more with Russia and putting all the pressure in Ukraine, because the last 2 weeks were only blackmail against Ukraine to sign the deal.
So do you not have faith that Europeans could step up, as they are all talking of doing, to fill the military void?
I think they are capable, and I think they should invest more in Ukraine's defense industry, because right now Ukraine is already producing at least 40% of weapons we need at the front line. And if we help to scale up that production, it will be really good for Ukraine. Of course, European allies can't replace Patriot air defense missiles, for example, that needed to protect Ukrainian cities. But they could buy those missiles from the US, even if the aid is cut.
I think there's an issue here about not Europe and Britain's ability to fill the gap, is how quickly you can. Yeah. You know, you've got to understand that if we were putting 10,000 troops into Ukraine, which would be equivalent to what we were maintaining in Iraq and Afghanistan, we'd need 30,000 troops on the ground, including support people. We just don't have that. So, you know, when we talk about managing the relationship between Zelensky and Trump, a lot of that is about buying us time so that we can make these difficult defence purchasing decisions, these difficult decisions around recruitment and hiring and rearming. Europe needs time in order to be able to provide the support that Ukraine needs.
Let's take a quick look, and I'd like your reaction to what we saw President Trump say during Starmer's visit.
This is indeed a unique friendship. It's been many years, and I think it's only gotten stronger, and we will make sure that it stays that way. We're going to have a great trade agreement one way or the other.
A special relationship, Edward, a trade agreement. I mean, that's not a bad place for a British Prime Minister to be, but is the price just doing what he says on Ukraine?
I mean, I go back to my earlier point that I think when it comes to Trump, you know, it's very transactional. You really, until the ink is dry, and possibly even there afterwards, I'm not sure that you can rely on any offers that are made. So I think there's still a lot to be seen when it comes to him.
Would you have been proud as a diplomat, Ian, if your Prime Minister had gone out and got that win, as people are describing it, that he got with President Trump?
Well, we need a trade deal with the United States of America. Our economy is struggling. We have massive amounts of unsustainable debt. We need to kind of reinvigorate these trade talks, and unfortunately that means a radical
if
shift.
Only there was a trading
Ukraine
bloc
policy
really close to us that we could get
those
to ties
I'm
to.
pro-European too. I agree with your Lib Dem
But do you have to
sensibilities
choose between the EU and America under Trump, Edward?
Certainly in terms of food standards, yeah, absolutely. You've got to choose between Europe and the US, unfortunately. Look, I think we are the nature of geopolitics has changed dramatically, and it's not entirely down to the US and its behaviour, but we've obviously got, you know, a far more aggressive Russia that is exerting its influence across Europe, not just in Ukraine. It is acting as a malign state towards a lot of European states and our friends in the Baltics and regions especially. We've got China looking across the straits at Taiwan. We've got Iran. We've got continuing instability in the Middle East. You know, ultimately Britain's role as a diplomatic power is to help bridge those gaps between our allies. It has always been the bridge between US and Europe, and we've got to find a way to continue to do that. That is speaking truth to our friends, it is increasing defence, it is working with our European allies, but it's also making sure that the US doesn't withdraw completely from its role as the international policeman.
Is it NATO that is now broken because of Trump's reluctance to engage with NATO and necessarily support NATO in Ukraine? Or is it actually just a failure of collective will of many member states of the European Union and NATO to, if you like, be called up to actually do what they say they're going to do? Italy do not want to come and be part of a peacekeeping force. Germany are not committing. Poland, I mean, this is not a united front.
It is both. NATO is broken. I'm a pro-European, including on the Brexit issue. I was against Brexit. We need to think about our sort of European collective security, including sort of with Ukraine. Right from the beginning, NATO has never been willing to fight for Ukraine. That's a basic truth. I've heard senior British ambassadors say that. And we didn't fight for Ukraine, and that's why we're in the situation we're in.
You're
today.
talking about Crimea?
I'm talking about everything since 2014.
We have got to be careful when we point the finger at some of our European allies and say, then, the reality is there is a strategic element to this. If Russia's dream is that we put 100,000 European troops locked into Ukraine, and suddenly Poland and the Baltics and the Nordics don't have the kind of defences they need. Russia is not stupid. It is looking for the next place it can penetrate. Russia is always looking for these soft points. We can't just say, let's move all of our troops to Ukraine. I absolutely agree that we need troops in Ukraine to support Ukraine.
But Svitlana, how much faith do Ukrainian people have in Europe that they will step up to defend? Never mind the capability. Do they feel Europe is really with them? When Germany are prevaricated, Italy are not going to send troops. The only coalition of the willing that our Prime Minister talks about seems to be France and the United Kingdom.
Unfortunately, I think Europe was too comfortable for these 3 years. They felt they were under American umbrella and America would manage all the problems in Ukraine for them. And here the time comes when Europe has to step up. And I would say that Ukrainians are glad that the allies are waking up and that summit in London with Keir Starmer and European allies really showing that there is some united vision towards how to bring peace to Ukraine.
Let's talk about another form of war. Trade war. Ian, are we in the middle of a trade war full on now that President Trump has started imposing tariffs on Canada, tariffs on Mexico, tariffs on China? He's putting a lot of faith that this is going to be good for his country. Will it work, trade wars?
I personally don't think trade wars will work, and I think long term that will backfire on the US in terms of the declining popularity of the dollar. This is the trend that we know about. As far as it relates to the UK, Keir Starmer's principal objective in going to Washington last week was to mount a charm offensive with Trump to reduce that possibility. But in any case, I think it's a fairly low risk for the UK, as our trade with the US is different from the European Union's trade with the US. The US has a surplus with us. It has a $300 billion deficit with the EU.
But for world trade, it's not necessarily going to bode well, is it? Edward, let's take a quick look at what Justin Trudeau, the still current Prime Minister of Canada, had to say.
Now, it's not in my habit to agree with the Wall Street Journal. But Donald, they point out that even though you're a very smart guy, this is a very dumb thing to do.
The reality is Donald Trump says these tariffs are going to earn him billions of dollars, but won't the price be higher inflation for Americans? How can that tension survive?
Well, I think the president is selling the policy to his own domestic fan base more than anything else when he says things like that. Look, we are regardless, we are going to be entering a period of high tariffs around the world. When America imposes tariffs, countries retaliate, and that's going to have a knock-on effect on trade. And that is not a good thing. As an internationalist and globalist, I want free trade around the world. But we've also got to recognise that there is an opportunity here for us to reshore a lot of our domestic manufacturing. That for too long we've relied on cheap manufacturing overseas. That creates supply chain insecurity for us. And in a globally unstable world, reliance on food production or manufacturing overseas creates a risk at home.
One thing, I'll ask you all this, just our last question if I may, and I'll start with you, Ian. One thing I think we can safely say is that the old world order seems to have been broken. Our correspondent talked about that from Kyiv. Is this something that we're all going to sit tight and ride out for 4 years of Donald Trump as president and then return to business as usual? Or has the world order changed forever?
I think the world order is changing, and I think Trump is accelerating that process. We've had a foreign policy, according to the Grand Old Duke of York, where we follow the Americans, whatever they do, when they go up the hill and back down the hill, as has happened under Biden and under Trump on Ukraine, to Ukraine's penalty. Actually, we need a defined European identity that includes Ukraine, and to wean ourselves off over reliance on the US longer term as part of that global shift to a multipolar world.
Svitlana, do you think Is it a matter of just riding out Donald Trump for the next 4 years?
Ukraine can't afford it. We can't continue fighting for 4 years and letting our people be killed, and we will have to find a way to make a deal that Trump wants so badly. Ukraine wants a deal so badly too. We want peace more
Giving
than
up
anyone
territory,
else.
you think, was almost certain?
US is pressuring Zelensky to legally give up territory to Russia, and Zelensky won't agree to it. He is ready to accept that the occupied territories will be temporarily under Russian control, but I don't see a scenario where he signs them off to Russia.
It does sound like the old world order is over. Edward, do we ride it out and go back to things business as usual, or not?
I don't think business will ever go back to usual. I think we now live in a multipolar world. We have regional powers as well that change the dynamic. I always say that as a Liberal Democrat, you've got to be an optimist, if nothing else, a glutton for punishment and an eternal optimist. And I do believe that by working with our friends and allies, we can find a way through these difficulties.
Edward Morello, Ian Proud, Svitlana Morentes, thanks very much for joining us here on Westminster Watch. And thanks again to all my guests who joined us, and make sure to connect with us on X at Westminster TRT. But for now, from me and all the team here, goodbye and thank you for watching.